Alright guys, so we're going to talk about the whole book of Leviticus today. So don't worry, it is doable, but we're just gonna hit it kind of thematically going through it and then dive in a few places here and there. So I'm actually probably the most excited about this, more than any of the other ones we've talked about. And I know that sounds strange, but just some really interesting concepts are in the book of Leviticus and kind of help us understand even the life of Jesus and some of the things that he did. So if you open up your note, I can't remember if it's the actual Hebrew word for Leviticus or the word Leviticus, or I guess it would be the Hebrew actual name. It's a continuation basically of what we interacted with in Exodus, and the book of Leviticus is just the word means and he said. So it's what happened in Exodus. And it's a continuation, and God said, to continue the storyline. So what was the main thing that we looked at the end of Exodus last week? We constructed what?
The tabernacle.
The tabernacle, yeah. And we had a word or a little phrase that we keyed in on called sacred space. And so the construction of the tabernacle was the construction of sacred space, right? And so now Leviticus is well, how in the world do we handle a nuclear explosion in the midst of our camp called God's presence? You can't just waltz up in there. So Exodus, yeah, I already said that. And so Leviticus, if you see in the notes, Leviticus is interesting. They don't move. So this whole book is just, they've constructed sacred space, and now it's just a description of what's going on. When we hit Numbers, then we start moving from the camp again, but this whole thing is static. It's in one place. So just a couple intro things there, and then so the next verses are going to be Exodus 40 and then Numbers 1. What I did here, it's really kind of helps us understand what Leviticus is doing. This is the last few verses of Exodus, and then the first verse of Numbers. So I'm just going to read it, see if you notice something, and then I'll point out what it is. Then the cloud, and we read this last week, or Tuesday. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Okay, now let's read Numbers 1, verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting. What's the difference there? Catch it? Yeah, he couldn't go in the first at the end of Exodus. But then after Leviticus, he goes in, and he's able to interact with the Lord. So the Bible Project says Leviticus worked. So now they're able to go in and interact with sacred space, which would normally he couldn't because of the glory of the Lord. So let's just, I guess, talk about the presence of the Lord, presence of Yahweh. I don't have a lot of insights here other than just the fact that God is sacred and holy, and the word holy would mean he's set apart, he's different, he's other than. And we talked about this last week, the difference between holy and common, or sanctified and set apart, and then just profane regular use of everything else. And the reality is, post Genesis 3, we're common. We are common. We have been tainted by sin and live in just a sinful environment around us. And so we can't just waltz into holy space and God's space, because God's presence is like the sun. You go close to that and you're not prepared for it, you just die. That's not because he's mean or anything. He's just so powerful. There's just the essence of God himself, that presence. Something common can't enter into that space. And that's what we're dealing with. That's the problem that we're dealing with here. And so that's what Leviticus is addressing. So I'm just going to read this little paragraph here. Exodus closes with the construction and erection of the tabernacle. Leviticus begins with the laws of sacrifice. The transition point is blurred between the two books, which kind of helps us understand the transition between we've got sacred space and now we're dealing with it. So Leviticus 1:1 is an incomplete verse. It is semantically and grammatically bound with Exodus 40, verses 34 and 35. And so the purpose of the book, again, is to weave itself into this tabernacle reality. And that's Leviticus. So that's kind of the intro that I want to give to the book. Now we're just going to deal with a few concepts related to sacred space. So, sacred space. This is important for us to understand. And we're going to have some categories kind of blown or just things we're not used to because we're moderns and we're dealing with ancients here. And the way God related to them. So sacred space. What sacred space is, as we go into the book of Leviticus and we talk about the tabernacle or later the temple, especially here in the camp of Israel before they spread out everywhere, is that sacred space is it's like concentric areas of sacred space that move outward from the Holy of Holies. So if you guys want to look at the picture here, I have a few pictures. Actually, one is just kind of the nuts and bolts. The next one is animated, and then that third picture in the notes is I guess it's a to scale model that's built in, I think it's in Israel somewhere, of the actual tabernacle of Moses. So they reconstructed something like it. But if you want to look back up at the top one, these are familiar concepts. The Holy of Holies, right? It's where the Ark of the Covenant is. That's where the nuclear bomb sits, or the nuclear reactor sits right there in the very center. And so, if you're in there, that's a problem. As you go out a little bit further, it's less of a problem, but we're still dealing with sacred space. So you go from the Holy of Holies to the holy place. And so the holy place would be where the priest would go, may or may not talk about them, but where the priest would go on a regular basis. But the Holy of Holies would be set aside for once a year. Right, and so that's the high priest's job. But the holy place they would go in and out of on a, I think, pretty regular basis. But then you have the outer court. And so all of these make up the temple or the tabernacle kind of complex. And it gets expanded out a lot when you reach later with David and Solomon when they build the actual temple. So, but these are kind of the basics of it. And the next concentric space, though, that we can kind of understand this is sacred space. But what about the next category, which is the camp of Israel? The camp of Israel is actually, as God's people, his chosen people, it's actually a bit of sacred space itself. And so, the camp of Israel, there's times where people have to be separated from the camp because they're unclean for some reason. And usually it's for a ceremonial reason. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but they would go out until they're able to be ceremonially clean, then they would come back in. This could be like they have a disease or something, and they can't be in the sacred space because, one, they have a disease, which I don't want to jump ahead, but for a reason we'll talk about in a minute, they would have to leave the camp until they're okay, and then they can come back in, right? And that has very practical reasons for that too, you don't want to make people sick, and John might jump in on some of that in a minute. But then, once they get into the land of Israel itself, it also is a bit of a sacred space too. Now, it's not where the nuclear reactor is, right? But the land of Israel, if we'll look at some of the stuff that the Canaanites were doing in the land, and it actually says that the actions of the Canaanites were defiling the land of Israel, and so the land was actually spewing them out. And God's like, don't do those things, or you'll defile the land. We talked about when one of the covenant disciplines way back was a removal of the people from the land of Israel. Do y'all remember that? Talked about the covenant disciplines. The height of the covenant disciplines would be God would remove the people from the land because you can't be in God's chosen land in that sacred space. You're defiling the land. So the people of Israel would actually have to be removed. And so we have these concentric areas of sacred space. God is at the center. And he's the reason that all of it is sacred. So that's sacred space. Questions about that? And there's a lot more that we could talk about that, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts. So questions on any of that stuff?
When it comes to the way the tribes were set up around the tabernacle, I've seen two different versions. I've seen one where it's more 3, 3, and 3, side by side. But then I've seen the 3 this direction, 3 this, this, and this, and it kind of makes a cross shape. So I didn't know which one was the order right there. Is it correct?
Yeah. So what he's talking about is you have the 12 tribes, and they surround the center where the tabernacle is. And you're right. Some would see it as a construction of almost like a cross. So like if Moses went up on the mountain and looked down, he actually saw a cross. That's what some have suggested, yeah. So I don't know which one's right though, but yeah, that's a good point to bring up. Yeah. Anybody else? I'll pitch it to you in just a minute because I want to hear any thoughts you might have on the ceremonial stuff, if you don't mind. But
I do have a question, actually.
okay.
So if we accept what you're saying, does that mean everything outside of the land of promise is profane in the eyes of God?
I don't know. I think
Or maybe at this time it is?
so. Like to some degree, the land. I think I'm just kind of making logical jumps here, but to some degree, the land would be more common than like the holy place, right? And so the land outside of the promised land that would be, I guess, less holy than that land, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's not something that I'm fully sure about.
Yeah.
So, but
I mean, that's basically what we're saying, right? Because we're
Mhm.
defining this as a holy space. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to think back on that.
yeah. So what he's saying is that basically, like God's land is the holy, sacred space, and everything outside of that is just. It's not like it's bad. It's just it's not as consecrated for a certain purpose. We could say it. We could say it that. But and really, these concepts kind of go back to creation, where the garden was sacred space, and everything outside of the garden was more common. It wasn't sacred space, and so you would be driven out from the garden. So the land kind of almost takes on that type of imagery. I feel like is what the Bible's doing. So, yeah. Anybody else?
I have one. So you briefly mentioned, so like if people, like if they defile the sacred space, like if they are sick or something, like they have to like leave like the camp and like their tribe altogether. Is that what you're saying? Or they can't be around the tabernacle?
So there's a lot of different like we'll actually talk about that in a little bit.
Okay.
But there's a lot of different like if you do this, here's the ritual to get clean from this, or if you do this, like you got to do all of these things. And so like something like leprosy or something like that, they would need to leave the camp entirely because I mean practically you can't get people sick type
Yeah.
thing.
Like
So
COVID, just quarantine.
they quarantine.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So, but then there were other things like if I forget when we get down into ceremonial impurity. If I forget to answer some of those questions, remind me, because I really want to answer that. But we'll actually work down to that. So, yeah. So we talked about sacred space, but now we got to ask, what defiles sacred space? What defiles sacred space? And there's two categories, and I want you guys to say this after me. Moral impurity. And then ritual impurity. So there's two categories. A person can be morally impure, or they can be ritually or ceremonially impure. And both of those disqualify you from entrance into the temple or tabernacle area. Okay, now some of these apply just for the Levitical priests. I guess I should say that you guys probably know this, but the Levites, the tribe of Levi, they were called to be priests to the Lord. So some of these laws pertain only to the Levites, but some of them would be more generally for the people as well. But the Levites, like if they were impure in either of these areas, they couldn't go into the temple because you can't just defile sacred space. Like that's not okay. Yeah.
What's the difference between the two?
That's where we're going. Good question. So yeah, let's talk about the difference. So moral impurities. What does the word moral sound like?
Mortality.
Okay, mortality. Not where I'm headed, but good.
Like if you do something wrong, like you sin.
If you do something wrong, yeah. So these would be sins. So sins, these are just a few of them, but like sexual immorality, murder or undue violence, or not caring for the foreigner. These type things would be, I put etc. because there's more, but these type things would be morally impure things in the eyes of the Lord. And these sins in the camp were seen to defile holy space. So if you're in the camp and you're doing these things, like you're messing up holy space. And so how do you cleanse holy space? What do we do? Like, you can't, you messed up, you defiled the holy space, you didn't like remove yourself. So now we've got holy spaces defiled, what do you do? And that's where the atonement comes in. So you guys have heard the word atonement, the atonement sacrifice or something like that. Atonement is how you cleanse sacred space. So it's back to a pristine place. So that's the purpose of atonement. It's not, it's centered around the concept of holy space. It's not like, oh, you're just bad and we need to correct you, though that is part of it. But you've defiled holy space at that point. Like you've done something problematic there. So now certainly, if you were outside the camp and did that as well, like you would still have a problem there. But the concept, it seems, at least for Leviticus, is we're just talking about holy space here. So atonement. So cleansed. So okay, yeah. So moral impurity is cleansed through various sacrifices and by referendum to the person wrong. So let's say you went out and you poked somebody's eye out. That's probably not a good one.
Nobody attempt that.
That's undue violence. That's good.
Yeah. It might be an eye for an eye one though. Let's go
What
for
if you something extreme like you didn't wear your mask?
Yeah, we had to like slaughter a bull for that one. So let's say you stole somebody's donkey. Okay, so you stole somebody's donkey. Well, you actually have to. God's not just okay with just, oh, we'll just put the sacrifice on the altar and you'll be good. You're fine. You actually have to pay the person back. It might be more than just give the donkey back, but you have to pay the person back and offer a sacrifice, and then the sin is dealt with. So this shows that God isn't just about like, oh, I'm sorry. No, you actually have to do an act of repentance and referendum back to Him. So that's one part of how moral issues were taken care of. One part, I think this is for pretty much all sacrifices. I know it's for like Day of Atonement stuff, but which we'll get to that. But the way this would work is the person would bring their sacrifice to the priest, place their hand on the head of the animal while confessing their sins. Then the life of the animal would be taken in place of the person. And I heard one person talk about, I don't know if this is right or not, but they would actually have to watch the priest slaughter the animal so that the person could feel the weight of their sin. Like, this is what my sin did, that I confessed it, and then I have to watch because like I'm supposed to feel the weight of what sin is. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I respect the person who said it. They know a lot more than I do. So cool. Last thing I want to say about the sacrifices for moral issues is these sacrifices would have been very costly for an ancient Israelite and their families. Often offering an animal due to sin committed might mean that your family didn't get to eat meat for many months. So meat wasn't just something you had, like we eat meat every single meal. They might every few months, if that. So like you've got a bull and that's worth a lot. And your sin, well, usually you wouldn't offer a bull, but we'll say a lamb. And your sin just made you have to give that thing up for your whole family. Like, it communicates the costliness of sinning right there. So, yeah. Need to get the weight of that one. But the last thing on this, we're going to get down to a picture here in a minute, but the last thing I want to talk about with atoning sacrifices is the Day of Atonement. And this is in Leviticus chapter 16. We're going to look at it, well, sort of look at it in a minute. But right here, what the Day of Atonement, has anybody heard the Day of Atonement? Keep it down in the back. What the Day of Atonement is one day, once a year, that was like a reset button for the nation. So the Day of Atonement, basically, conceptually, the sins accumulated over the year, progressively defiling sacred space. So like sins are accumulated, and a lot of times like somebody might sin, and they don't bring a sacrifice, or they do a sin that they don't even realize was a sin, or something happens. But also just even, I think the ones that are covered for through sacrifice, it just progressively defiles the land and even the tabernacle, such that one day a year they took the Day of Atonement, and they would actually slaughter. This was the day that the high priest would take a goat into the Holy of Holies and slaughter it at the Ark of the Covenant. And so it would cleanse the sins for the whole nation. One sacrifice. Same thing, he would confess the sins of the nation over the sacrifice and kill the animal. But then there was a second goat, and this will be significant. There was a second goat that the sins were confessed over, and the goat was sent out into the wilderness outside of the camp to die and carry the sins outside of the camp and die in the wilderness. The Day of Atonement is the sacrifice that Jesus' death most clearly fits into. So the Temple Institute, there's all number of sacrifices, and a lot of them don't have to do with sin. And most of them, like Jesus' sacrifice, wouldn't even be in the same category. Like Jesus' sacrifice doesn't even cover the same things. They're not corollary. But this one is what the book of Hebrews places Jesus' sacrifice most clearly into the Day of Atonement. So if you guys have heard of the scapegoat, that's the second goat that would be sent out into the wilderness, the scapegoat. So, yeah, that's all I have for moral impurity. Anybody have any questions so far? I'll go to ritual next.
Well, isn't it like when they went into like the most inner part of the tabernacle? It's like if they weren't like consecrated or whatever, they would like die.
Yeah.
Or
So
looking at God.
you go up to the nuclear reactor and you don't have your suit on, you die. And so you go into the Holy of Holies and you haven't done the proper cleansing ceremonies. You bring in common unholy defilement into the presence of God. Yeah, you're done for. It's just the way it is. Again, it's not because he's mean. It's just you can't have the two next to each other. And God's not going anywhere. So, yeah. Anybody else?
Didn't they like wear bells or something? They had like a rope tied to them with bells or something.
Yep.
So they just didn't hear the bells move. Like, oh, he did.
Oh my God.
But they have to get them out.
Yeah, there's a rope tied to them, and they pull them out.
Fishing at the tabernacle.
That's
Cool. All right, let's move on. So we talked about moral impurity. This is pretty, that makes sense. Like, you sinned, you're not going in the presence of God. But what about ritual impurity? Like, what is that? So this would be something like touching or eating unclean animals. And you're like, well, what does that have to do with anything? So there was actually a list of, you guys probably know about it somewhat, but kosher meats or kosher animals. These were animals that Israel, and even into today, that Jewish people can eat. They're called clean animals. But then there's a list of, there's a list of clean animals. And then basically, how does that work? Anyway, there's a list of unclean animals that they can't eat. And so those would be things that if they touch those, or heaven forbid they ate those, they would be ritually unclean. So if you touch one, then, well, we'll get to what you do for that. So unclean animals, they would make you ritually or ceremonially unclean. And what that also did was it made them distinct from the other nations. So a lot of these things are to show like, hey, we are set apart to God and we're distinct from the rest of the nations. So a lot of the things you'll read that's like, why do they have a problem if I have two different fabrics woven together into my shirt? What's the problem with that? And for the ancient world, it was to show we don't have mixture. We're not to have mixture, we're to be different. And the other nations have mixture. Those type things. Or we're not to mix with other nations. So these are just symbolic things that would communicate to an ancient person different truths like that. So the next thing that would make you ceremonially or ritually impure would be if you have a skin condition. So like, a severe skin condition, like, I don't know, somebody give me one.
Vitiligo.
What was that?
Vitiligo.
Yeah. I've never heard of that, but yeah, something like that.
I feel like eczema.
Eczema. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, that's good.
Really? Eczema?
Yeah.
Are you talking about stuff that like where you have like sunspots and like different colors of skin?
I don't even know if it would be that, but like, let's say you've got like scaly skin, not just like a sunburn, but like, something like very noticeable
Sores.
sores, especially open sores or stuff like that.
Something they can get under people's sink or something like that.
Yeah, it could be that. It doesn't even have to be that though, I don't think. But I probably should have found out better how to define this better, but basically like skin conditions like a rash or open sores or stuff like that. So, do you know more about that by chance?
No, I never thought about it from just the prospect of being ritually unclean. I always thought about it as not like arbitrary laws passed down, but like
Yeah.
provisions to preserve his people.
Yeah.
My mind's wandering. I'm just wondering like what would have been the Levitical directive for COVID, like, and
Yeah.
just those whole things. But yeah, I don't know. I've always linked it to like how contagious it was. But you can clearly see that like with our modern understanding of science. Like
Yeah.
how long you have to stay, well, that's how long the fever runs its course, and then you're no longer, and so the ancients didn't understand this, but God was protecting them while he was also keeping them pure. So it's really cool.
Did you guys hear that? That's the really cool part about the Levitical law and the Torah is that they don't understand some of these things. Now, sure, they probably would have figured some of it out, like, this person's sick, we should probably not be near them, because every time we get near them, we die. But, like, God gave them, like, these clear laws of this is how you are to keep yourselves from dying from diseases and stuff. So, it's genius. It's, yeah, really fascinating. Some of these, though, I think were just, like, if you had these skin conditions, even if it may not be contagious, they made you ritually impure, and I'll point out why in just a minute. But the next one would be bodily fluids emission. So two different, we're getting into adult space here, but two different ones would be reproductive fluids. So that would, if you came in contact with that, or let's say, these would be the Levite men that would be doing the priestly service. So let's say that a man had intercourse with his wife. There would be a certain amount of time before he could go into the Holy of Holies, or into the temple sanctuary and do his priestly duties, stuff like that. Also, like interaction with the blood of especially like a corpse. Any corpse or dead body, which is actually the next one down. If you interact with a corpse of a person, or especially an unclean animal, you're ritually impure. But let's say, if a woman is on her cycle, like that, if a man came near her during that period, he would be ritually unclean. So these are just the type things that make somebody ritually impure to be able to enter into holy space. Okay, so these would be specifically for like the Levites as they're working in the temple type stuff. So blood, dead bodies, and then touching mold. So like you got a house that's got like mold or stuff around it, and that house needs to either be cleansed. If you can't get it out, you got to burn it down, type stuff. So why is this? Well, first of all, how do you get ritually clean again once you've done this? And the basic thing is you wash and wait. You take a bath, you wait a certain amount of time, and you're good, right? So it's taken care of. So very different from a moral one where you have to like bring in sacrifice and pay the person back. Is different. So each of these, okay, so here's the reason why you'll kind of notice a trend between the different things that make you impure. Each of these represented death to the Israelites and thus made them unfit to enter Yahweh's presence. So this one may not seem as intuitive, but bodily fluids that were communicated reproductive. Those were they were life and death. So basically you had life being, excreted from the body, but now it's death. But these things could bring life. And so if you came in contact with those things, you're coming in contact with basically somebody's life. And so blood, the life of the flesh was in the blood. And so you're coming in contact with basically death at that point. And death and life, God's life, you can't have death in the same vicinity as God's life. And so like a skin sore, it looks like external death to an ancient mind. It's like part of your skin is dying. So these would be different things that would communicate death to an ancient person. And so, and mold, it looks like very much like a skin sore, but on your wall. So it's weird that just the categories that we're talking here, but each of these fit into things that would represent death to the mind of an Israelite. And you don't bring death into God's presence, who is life. Does that make sense? Yeah, just kind of makes it a little less arbitrary and kind of understanding this is why we're doing this. And then let's see. Yeah, I'll stop there. Any questions on any of that? Outside of normal categories, but.
Do you think part of the reason why, like, the men couldn't be in contact with women while they're on their cycle is because they didn't have proper hygiene back then? So there was no way to, like, deal with it in a hygienic way. It was just gross.
Yeah, I think certainly, and maybe you can speak into this, but certainly there's things that we're reading here that wouldn't apply to us today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Modern.
do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I'm not going to speak into that.
Okay.
I mean, we're all adults here.
Yeah.
You all probably have a girlfriend at some point in your life.
That's what Anna and I were saying, you're talking, like, it's just weird to me that, like, intercourse, I understand, that's a controllable act, but
Mhm.
when a woman's on her cycle, like, you don't choose that. That's not,
Okay.
that's
This
like
is
God made that and then it's like, oh.
This is a good segue. So question, were these sinful things?
Yeah.
Were these sinful things? Okay, you touched a dead body because your dad died and you had to carry him to the cemetery. Are you sinful for touching that dead body? No. That's why we have these two categories. One is moral issues. You actually did a sin. The next one, though, is just ceremonial issues. And so most of Israel was ceremonially impure most of the time. There's no way to get outside of it. It's just, if you're going to interact with the temple, tabernacle area, then you have to, I mean, there's things for guys too, like you have to be ceremonially clean before you enter in. It's just as simple as that. So there's no moral culpability in the situation. It's just part of being human. Yeah, and that's about as best an answer as you can get in that. So the rest of it's like, why God?
So like mainly like the Levites had to like be careful of like the unclean and the clean.
Yeah, especially the Levites. I think, I mean, the rest of Israel would, I think, go into like the outer area as well at different times, but definitely the Holy of Holies and most holy place. Yeah.
So if a Levite was married, he couldn't be with his wife during that time?
Yeah, it's like, so if if they have relations, there's like a certain amount of time, I can't remember the amount of time, and then they could go right back in. Go. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what's interesting though is that a person could be ceremonially impure, but still be morally pure. So like you could touch a dead body and you're not sinful, but you couldn't be morally impure and still be ceremonially impure. So like if you've committed a sin, then you're hitting both categories at that point, in essence, in a way. So these two categories had to be dealt with to be able to enter into the tabernacle and sacred space. Next question, I want to throw this out to you. Was Jesus ever unclean so that he could not go to the temple? Was Jesus ever unclean?
Got a 50-50 chance.
Got a 50-50 chance.
I would say yes only because of the story where he prayed over the girl who was dead.
Okay. Jesus was probably ceremonially unclean like the rest of Israel most of the time. It's part of being alive. So this helps us because we think of like, well, Jesus, like no way. But this is just talking about, this is just life. And so like, a lot of people think that Jesus' father Joseph died. Well, Jesus is the oldest son. He's going to have to help, deal with that situation. And so he probably came in contact with a corpse and was ceremonially impure for a certain amount of time. Right? So Jesus was ceremonially unclean for periods of time, and if you wanted to go to the temple, you had to wash and wait. You had to go through the steps to be able to enter the temple. It's just part of it. But this also shows some of the like seriousness of like when he would go and touch a leper, or not get angry at the woman who had the issue of blood, right? So she's taking a big risk because like she's gonna make this rabbi ceremonially unclean. Whoa. And he has mercy, and she's healed, and everybody's like, because they understand the situation. We wouldn't, but they would. So, yeah, this is back to the Leviticus thing.
We had Lazarus and stuff like that too.
Yep, yep. Good. Okay, so other types of things, other types of offerings outside of like purity offerings or atonement offerings. There are other types of offerings we're given as Thanksgiving offerings. So these would be just like you're wanting to express your thankfulness to the Lord. You're wanting to give a praise offering, and so you would give these Thanksgiving offerings and free will offerings to show gratitude. During this period, while Israel was still in a close proximity, so later on they're more spread out. But right now, where we're talking about, they're in close proximity, they're in a camp together. And if they were to slaughter and eat an animal, so like let's have some steaks tonight, you would actually take the animal to the tabernacle and slaughter the animal there, and you would have your meal before the Lord, like rejoicing before the Lord and having a meal before the Lord. So often there were a lot of, they had a lot of barbecues at the tabernacle, but kosher barbecues, so no pork. They couldn't have pig. But they would, well, for them it's like us not eating dog. Like, we're not going to eat dog.
Yeah.
For them it'd be like, we're not eating pig. So that's a cultural thing. But often eating meat only occurred a few times a year for Israelite families, if that. So, but when they did, they would generally take it to the temple and have a barbecue. So, let's keep on moving so we can hit all of this. But this next picture is really neat, I think, and it's the structure of Leviticus. And what it does is, are you able to pull that up?
My notes end right there, actually, so. But I know.
Okay. The rest are pictures, so that's probably
Okay.
why. Yeah, so this is the structure of, I was going to send it to you, but I can't do that here. The structure of Leviticus is, it forms, a friend of mine, David Rickman, sent this to me. But have you guys heard of a chiasm, or chiastic structure? Some of you have. John really has. He read a whole book on it. Yeah, a chiastic structure, second and third years, you guys will definitely know them. But basically, a chiastic structure is where a text in the scriptures has a center point, and at the center point is kind of the main point, or some of the main emphasis, or maybe it communicates the theme of the section, as I think Leviticus kind of does. But then what would happen is you would go out from that center, and it would be like mirroring one another. So you would like have an A in the center, then like B and B on the next side, then C and C, D and D. And so basically, like you would have, you can actually look at it here. If you look at that picture, look at 19 at the bottom of the picture. That's chapter 19. So chapter 19 forms like the center of a chiastic structure, but then it works out in either direction from there. And so 18 and 20 are regulations, so sexual regulations, and talk about Molech. And then 20, sexual regulations of sex and Molech. And it works out, it's not the cleanest chiasm. There's parts that are more reflective than others. But a guy, I can't remember his name, who spent like his whole life on Leviticus, came up with this structure. And such that, like when they were weaving together Leviticus, he said like they put things in places like on purpose to create this structure. I think it's pretty compelling. But I thought we would just work through a few of these, and then we'll pretty much be wrapping up. But so the first two sections, I think 1 through 9 and 27. No, I'm sorry, just 27. That chapter closes it out. It's kind of like he calls it a latch section, but it's kind of like, I think it stands out by itself. But let's see, what do we want to hit here? So 1 through 9 talk about like the consecrating things, where like if you were to do the let's not go there because we're running out of time. So 1 through 9 talk about different sacrifices and things set apart to God in consecration. Chapter 10 is an example. It's actually a narrative where the holy place is defiled. And if you guys want to actually pull out of the note and out of the picture and go down, I took a picture at the very bottom. It's chapter 10. This is just a brief section there. But Nadab and Abihu, you guys heard of them, the sons of Aaron who brought strange fire into the tabernacle. God had said, basically, when you bring fire in, you do it this way, and they like brought in some strange fire, and that meant more to them than it does to us. And they sinned in the presence of the nuclear reactor, and they died. And Moses was like, let me actually read it. Then Moses said, "It is what the Lord said, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people, I will be honored." So they didn't treat the presence of God as holy. And they were priests, like the sons of Aaron. And there was a problem. They died in the presence. So that's chapter 10. If you guys look, chapter 11 through 15 mirrors chapters, where is it? Chapters 21 through 22. I point that out because we talked about the ritual and moral impurities. So those two talk about blemishes and leprosy, but that section deals more with the ritual type things, and then the other reflexive section does with like the more moral stuff. So you can see that. Chapter 16, it tells like the nuts and bolts of how to do the Day of Atonement. So we talked about that. But then it reflects up to chapter 23. Chapter 3 introduces a final concept that I wanted to just mention. We talked about sacred space and how to deal with it. But there's also the idea of sacred times. So these would be like sanctuaries in time, where God is saying, okay, now we're going to treat this particular portion of time as sacred and holy. And so you do certain things on these certain times. So Sabbath is a weekly, like, temple in time, where God is saying, we're going to treat this time as holy. But all the feasts of Israel are laid out as these sacred times, and they would be feasts to the Lord, and they would do celebrations and things like that. The Day of Atonement is one of those sacred times, and that's discussed in chapter 16, the nuts and bolts of how to do it, but then the actual time is set out in chapter 23. So, working on down chapter 17, I think you actually read about this in your Old Testament book. 17 is it's like a bridge, like a pause, kind of like a summary, but not really summarizing, but it's just kind of like it's set there to kind of move us to the next section. And then 18 and 20 are interesting, and I actually want to probably come to a close with these. Open up that picture. You probably don't have to open it, but chapter 18. This is talking about sexual regulations, and then the god Molech. And this is interesting, and I'm glad we covered it back with Noah, but this actually connects us back to the story of Noah cursing his son with his son, I can't remember, was it Ham? Cursed Ham? Yeah. But Ham's son, remember we talked about Ham went in and uncovered his father's nakedness? Do y'all remember us talking about that? We talked about what that meant, that it probably meant that he went in and actually had sexual relations with his mother or stepmother, or however that, I guess it would be his mother, however that worked. And then we looked and we saw that it said he uncovered the nakedness of his father. And you're like, well, what does that mean? But then we get to Leviticus and we read some things that make us think that, well, he probably had sexual relations with his mother, and maybe that offspring from that relationship was the Canaanites, or Canaan. Because Ham curses, Noah curses not his son Ham, but his grandson Canaan. And so you're like, well, that's interesting. You mean that Canaan came from immoral sexual relations that were not God ordained? Could be. But let's jump in here because chapters 18 and chapters 20 tell us stuff like don't have sex with your sister, or don't have sex with your mother, or don't have whatever. And then it says, because the Canaanites do those things. See what's happening? Canaan came because of something like that, came about in that. And Canaan has entered into the land that God promised to Israel. And God's saying, these people have done these atrocious things, and y'all don't do them because Canaan does that type of stuff. But I actually want to look at a couple of the verses, just so we have that in our mind. You can pull up the picture here. This is chapter 18. I'm just going to jump in at verse 6. None of you shall approach any blood relatives of his to uncovered nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, that is, the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You are not to uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's nakedness. So that's what's happening with Noah and his son Ham. Jump over to verse 24. Do not defile yourself by any of these things. Why? For all these, the nations which I am casting out before you, have become defiled. Or by these things, the nations that I'm casting out before you have become defiled. So basically, Israel's about to enter into the land, right? The promised land. And God's going to remove all these other nations. And he's saying, don't sin like these, because those nations that I'm driving out, they became defiled by doing these sins. So God is saying these are defiled nations. And that's why they're being driven out, because of what they've done, because of their sins. Verse 25, therefore I've brought its punishment upon it, so that the land has spewed out its inhabitants. So it's actually talking about these inhabitants in the land that have sinned. The land itself is spewing them out. Like it's saying you are defiling the land, and it's kicking it out, whatever that looks like. 27, for the men of this land who have been before you have done all these abominations, and the land has become defiled. So the nations that are in the promised land right now, before Israel gets there, they're actually defiling the land. And this is part of the reason they're being driven out. But Israel is coming in. And then lastly, so the land spewed them out. But this just goes back to our concept of holy space. These nations are committing sins, abominations. They're serving Molech and sacrificing their children to the god of Molech. And so they're defiling the promised land that God is going to give to Israel. And so God is spewing them out, driving them out. But that's chapter 18. Then chapter 19 is the center. What's interesting about chapter 19, just one comment, that is where Jesus is, if you remember, Jesus is asked what are the most important laws? And he quotes two places. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's Deuteronomy 6. And then he says, love your neighbor as yourself. That, love your neighbor as yourself, is from Leviticus 19. So right here in the center is that verse. So I think that's interesting. But we just covered a lot. Good job hanging with me today. Are there any questions?
I have one.
Okay.
So in verse 18 it says, you shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a rival while she is alive to uncover her nakedness.
Yeah.
What about Jacob?
That's a good question.
All of Israel's named after him.
You know, it's funny because that story, if you go back to it, it almost seems like he treats Rachel with more favor, right? And I think that the law is almost reflecting back on those things like, this is not the right thing to do. The patriarchs are not painted in the best light, like they mess up a lot. So probably not the best thing for him to have done, but he was kind of tricked into it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. But, anybody else? John, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
I'm sure you've touched on it, but the Canaanites aren't in the land violating these things, but God's chosen people are. And so the fact that you think they can persist in that condition when the law clearly says otherwise. So they are destined to be spewed out and then regathered. And it's just interesting to me, like the time course. Like he's so patient and long suffering with them that they're just there and just not really following Yahweh and not really, living in light of the covenants that have been given to them. So it's sobering stuff. The whole thing is really sobering. It's easy to kind of get distracted by the arbitrariness of it or giggle here and there, but it's just like we have such a watered down view of God's holiness and sovereignty in light of some of these things. And I just think of the sons of Aaron and just the higher level, of expectation and demand on teachers of the law, even now, and yet there's grace and there's the loving God in the midst of all of it. But
Yeah.
it's good.
So John brought up a good point to bring it into the present. So Israel, after Numbers, they finally enter into the land. Numbers and Deuteronomy. And they start doing the things that God said don't do. And they defile the land. And they're removed from the land in 586 by the Babylonians. And so they're removed because they're defiling the land. But then they're able to come back partially. But if we believe that God is still cares about his national covenant with Israel, then that means, and we've talked about it briefly, that means that they're in the land in a lot of ways still breaking these covenant commands. So not everybody, but quite a few are defiling the land in some ways. Now there's not a temple, there's not a tabernacle, so not everything continues on into the present, but it's still sacred space because it's the land. And so they're defiling it now. And we love Israel, we pray for Israel, we support them, but we have to understand that they're not walking in God's ways, and the ultimate end is they will be removed from the land, it seems like, one final time at the end of the age. And that's the final covenant discipline. But then Jesus comes back to regather them, I believe, is what the scriptures tell. So, it brings this kind of stuff into the present in a weighty way. But, yeah. Anybody else? Cool. John, do you mind closing us in prayer?
Yeah.
That'd be all right.
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Lord, that we may look at your law and delight and see wondrous things. And I just thank you for clarity in this. I thank you for bringing these truths to Cameron's heart and his mind, giving him conviction to convey this to young, impressionable minds. And I just pray that they would take hold of that and these truths would marinate into their heart and into their mind and into their soul and would not just be facts on paper, but would create real life changes and conviction and compassion for you and your story. And I just thank you so much that your story hasn't been rewritten and changed and altered, but it persists and it's still the same. And you show us these truths and you allow us to partake in your program for redemption of all mankind. And we just thank you for these guys and their hunger, and just ask you to bless them and keep them in your fold and watch over them. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, sir. So guys, I would take this picture that I sent you guys. I wanted to spend more time on it, but it gives kind of a rough picture of the structure of Leviticus. You can actually go to the chapters and see these things, how they mirror one another. It's pretty interesting.